Welcome to the program. Maurie McInnis joins me. She's a vice provost at the University of Virginia and a professor of art history. Maurie, welcome to the program. I'm so glad you're here.
I'm thrilled to be here.
So I want to ask you about the debate in conversation in Charlottesville today. Has everything to do with a certain statue in a certain park downtown. It's a statue to Robert E. Lee,
Right.
Confederate general. Beautiful statue, equestrian statue, him on Traveler, his horse. It's in Lee Park that was named for the statue. It was installed in 1924. Two of the counselors on Charlottesville City Council have recently come out publicly and said, we want to take it down. We don't think that any kind of monuments that celebrate the Confederacy have any place in a progressive city in the 21st century, in the North or the South. And this has sparked quite a debate, which we've talked about on this program. I wanted to talk to you, Maurie, about this, to get the angle of an art historian. And what crosses your mind when you hear this debate going on in this conversation? From your experience and your knowledge and what you've researched and teach, what should we be keeping in mind as we engage in this debate?
Yeah, so first, one of the things that I think is so exciting is that we are having this debate, right? We are talking about our public spaces and what role they play in public life. So one of the things art historians study about memorials is the role they play in shaping a community's understanding about the past. And one of the roles that monuments play is to help create what we often refer to as a collective memory or a collective narrative. They help define a city's sense of themselves,
Right.
and what they mean and what their history is. And that's exactly why they are so controversial. And they tend to be controversial at the moment that they are being considered, in the selection of what they look like, and then in their afterlife. And it's important.
They're never not controversial.
Right, in some ways not.
Right.
In some ways, they are always a topic of discussion. Now, sometimes after many years go by, people do tend to, forget it. They walk by them every day and they forget what they're even about. But national events can then bring to the surface whatever was at the core of the reason why that monument was erected.
Right.
Because sometimes stretching over many decades, it now has a new relevance.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
I think that's what's going on here.
So let's talk about that.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the context of that statue in particular. And there's a whole bunch across the South, and certainly in Richmond as well,
Right.
on Broad Street. There's a number of statues that celebrate the Confederacy.
Yes.
What's the context for that? The Lee statue went up 60 years after the Civil War.
Right. And that is a really important point to remember, that most of these monuments across both the American South and the North, because there are monuments related to the war between the states, as Southerners would have said at the time,
Right.
or the American Civil War, as Northerners would have said at the time, that were about the moment these monuments were erected, in many ways much more so than they were about the Civil War. So they tell us more about, for our local circumstance, 1920 in Charlottesville than they do tell us about 1860. And it's that story that we need to understand, the why.
Right.
In
We need to
1920,
understand.
we need a monument to Robert E. Lee. Right?
Yeah, so why is it that all of
Why?
a sudden
So-
Virginians in Charlottesville are like,
Yeah.
we need a monument to Robert E. Lee of all people, who you might remember from 60 years ago. We need a monument of him in the heart of our city in the 1920s. What's happening in the 1920s in Virginia, for example, that might
Right.
spark that?
Right. So what's happening is a long progression that starts really almost immediately after the war is done, when Reconstruction is in place in the American South, and essentially the local governments have been given over in the mind, this would be the mind of white Southerners, has been given over to Northerners and African Americans, and essentially not the people who were in power before.
Right.
Right.
It's a complete change.
Complete sea change. Their world is turned upside down. And when Reconstruction ends and the federal government gives up its commitment to ensuring the equality of African Americans as citizens in the American South, the white elite from before the war reasserts its local political power. And that's really the moment when we see this memorial landscape start to proliferate across the American South. So one of the largest and most important of these monuments is erected in Richmond in 1890 to Robert E. Lee on Monument Avenue. And in many ways, it inaugurates decades of memorialization of the American Civil War, but it's much more about modern politics. It's much more about the reassertion of white political power. The people who were in charge before the war are in charge again after the war.
And it's not so much a memorial to the past as it is a sign to all of those in the present,
Right.
We're back in charge.
That's right. We're back on top,
Right.
essentially. And in fact, there's this amazing quote from an African-American man in the black newspaper called the Richmond Planet at the time when the memorial is being unveiled. And he says, "The white folks is on top. The white folks is always on top." And he understands that that memorial is an embodiment to the new white political power that begins the disenfranchisement of African Americans in Virginia, that is then codified in the new Constitution passed in Virginia in 1901, and is really the culmination of what we often refer to as Jim Crow laws. The Jim Crow laws are a series of laws that segregate white and black, that make unequal the access to schooling and services across the American South. And these monuments are really about that.
Yeah, these are monuments, artwork that celebrates Jim Crow and
Yes.
the Jim Crow era, the KKK era, much more so than they are anything to do with the Confederacy.
Yes, yes. But the Confederacy for Southerners in the early 20th century embody a set of somewhat manufactured ideals that they believed the pre-war period represented. So chivalry and honor and white power. It's all wrapped up in the same narrative.
Yeah.
And that's what these monuments are as much about as they really are about the Civil War.
So what do you say then to the people who are like, I can appreciate that, I understand all that, but I still don't want to see it taken down? Phyllis Leffler was on this program, historians at UVA, Gary Gallagher, one of the world's most preeminent Civil War historians. And they have argued, and a lot of people have argued, that we shouldn't be hiding this away in a museum. We should put that museum experience, that learning experience, in a public park. And then when we start talking that way, we start talking about art. We start talking about the power of art,
Yes.
community art in public spaces, to educate and inform, and to, as the city council in Charlottesville have said, to change the narrative that that statue is writing in the 1920s.
Right, right. And one of the things that I think a lot of people who are saying we shouldn't tear down these monuments are mindful of is the fact that if we wipe away that history, will we still be talking about it? It's really important that we not forget the period of segregation that follows the American Civil War. I think for many people it's easy to leap from Civil War to the present and forget that there was nearly 100 more years after the American Civil War of enormous racial injustice in this country. And I think for a lot of the people who are
violence.
And violence.
Yeah,
horrible.
horrific violence, yeah.
I think people who are advocating not removing those statues are thinking very much about not whitewashing our landscape, not erasing our opportunities to educate about that moment. But that doesn't necessarily mean we just leave things as they are.
No, of course not.
Right?
No.
It may be that what we really need to do is add to that public landscape. Let's add new monuments and new memorials that allow us to talk to other narratives that in many ways are erased in the big landscape of Confederate nationalism in the U.S.
Yeah. What's your response as somebody who studies the power of art and the history of that power and how it interacts with public spaces? What's your reaction to those who say, I'm a man of color, I come into a park in my own hometown, I bring my son here, I'm offended and horrified that this statue is still here. What crosses my mind is not just the history, but also the art. That we also have a very long history of art that offends. And there's also, that's part of this narrative too, that should we be timid about art that offends?
No, we shouldn't be. I mean, one of the things that I think most art historians would hold pretty close to their heart is the danger of iconoclasm, right? The danger of the destruction of art, or the danger of censorship of art, both of those, right?
Right.
That art is one of the most powerful forms of human expression. And art has a way to communicate.
Aside from language, the oldest,
exactly,
yeah.
one of the oldest. And you know, art historians often study in the past periods of the destruction of works of art, and we always lament those. I mean, look at how distraught we all are at the destruction of monuments under ISIS control at the moment, right? They are wiping away centuries of vitally important human history. And it's very easy, I think, on a local level to think that a little monument with a guy on a horse, not very important. How could that be artistically important? How could that be important down the ages? I'm not sure we're the people to make that judgment. I worry about reacting too quickly and making a mistake and destroying something that you can never get back.
And seeing
But I am also, at the same time, really sensitive to that argument.
Of course.
Right? And so,
Yeah.
are there other pathways? Are there ways that we can add to the memorial landscape that allows different monuments to talk to one another and make very different statements?
Right. Because when you do that, then you create a space where citizens can talk to one another.
Right.
And ideas can talk to one another. And I'm just troubled by the idea of a government, local or otherwise, getting in the business of making statues disappear, of making a memorial landscape, you know, wiping it away like an eraser, based on, you know, whatever happens to be the movement of the day.
Right. And ugly events in our past are ones we need to be willing to embrace and confront.
Right. And along those same lines, you have been involved at UVA with the President's Commission on Slavery in the University, which is looking at that very idea of the grim realities of our shared past at the University of Virginia, and how the landscape at UVA needs to tell that story, needs to be a memorial landscape to the good and the bad.
Right, right. I mean, I think UVA is in a really unique position as an institution of higher learning to help grapple with one of the paradoxes at the core of the United States and who we are. So the University of Virginia, designed and founded by Thomas Jefferson, who wrote our nation's ideal that all men are created equal, and founded an institution that also was founded on an ideal about creating an educated citizenry for the continuance of American democracy, was simultaneously an institution designed to run on the back of American slavery. It could not have existed without American slavery. And that paradox is a difficult one for us to wrap our mind around. We really like narratives where we have good people and bad people, and where we can divide everything into camps. But
all of our problems are solved in less than 30 minutes or less than an hour and a half.
Exactly. And the problem with American history is it's rarely neat and tidy.
Yeah.
And somebody like Jefferson embodies ideals we continue to strive for, but that we continue to fall short of, just as he did. And that, in many ways, is an opportunity the University of Virginia has to tell a very different history of its past.
And in the same way, the city of Charlottesville, and not just the government, but the larger community of Central Virginia, has an enormous national opportunity to lead here and show the world, here's a southern city coming to terms with the lost cause, with the myths of the lost cause.
That's right.
Look what we're doing in Charlottesville.
Yes.
It's a great opportunity that has everything. I keep coming back to this, but it has everything to do with art. That's what these statues are. It's artwork.
Right.
It's a beautiful story and an important one. Let's take a quick break. When we get back, we'll have some news for the viewers and an announcement that we'll talk about. So stay with us. I'm Coy Barefoot, and we'll be right back. Welcome back to the program. Maurie McInnis is with us. She's a vice provost at the University of Virginia and a professor of art history. And Maurie, you've announced recently that you are getting ready to leave Charlottesville. As a matter of fact, as we have this conversation, you are just days away from packing up the family truckster and getting on the highway. You're headed to, well, where are you going? What's going on? It's very exciting.
It is very exciting. I am going to be the next executive vice president and provost at the University of Texas at Austin.
Which is one of the nation's largest public universities.
That it is, 50,000 students.
50,000, it's amazing. So with the time that we have left on the program, I wanted to have a conversation and get your thoughts about higher education in America. Mm-hmm. And as you head to Austin and this really exciting new chapter in your life, personally and professionally, what crosses your mind about higher ed and the mission of, liberal arts in the 21st century and the charge that these universities have to serve the world, not just to serve their students, but to serve the world through their faculty and through their students?
Yeah. So as we look at the landscape in American higher education today, we are, I think in many ways, facing a potential future fork in the road. And I really think we need to be very mindful that we don't let that happen, where our public institutions are increasingly starved and our private institutions become increasingly wealthy. And that would be so bad for the future of the United States. Public higher education has driven the American economy over the last century. The boom of 20th century America, the American century as it's often referred to, had so much to do with the innovation that emerges in American public higher education, where higher education was at a cost level where everybody could afford to attend, where all those
that's the key. Yeah.
That's the key. All those of talent and merit, no matter their ability to pay, have access to public higher education. Higher education needs to remain an engine for innovation, creativity, and research. And in some ways, I think I think we have to blame ourselves, have somehow or another lost the confidence of the American public, right? States are drawing back their support of American public higher ed in dramatic amounts. If we just look back over the last quarter century, it has been a dramatic disinvestment in American higher education, meaning
not just in Virginia, but all over the country.
All over the country. This is a nationwide story. And so everyone's tuition has gone up and up and up and up.
To cover the gaps.
To cover the gaps. And yes, many schools have financial aid, but really, shouldn't we as a society be investing in the future of the United States? Because that's what public higher education represents.
It seems so shorted in the legislatures across this country that economic development just it manifests itself as just another plan to give money and tax breaks to corporate America, when they don't recognize the bigger story, the historical story that you've just portrayed here, that the greatest economic development initiative we had in the 20th century was to invest in education.
Right. I mean, look at the boom after we sent the GIs back to college.
Bingo.
Right?
Yeah.
But the challenge, I think, is our politicians run on such short cycles, right? And they get judged on things that happen in very short cycles. Education is an investment that doesn't sometimes pay off for 10, 20, or 30 years. And it's not a obvious direct return. And one of the things
Right.
we've started doing in higher education is talking about return on investment. You know, if you major in this at this school, your ROI 30 years out will be X. And I worry
it's
about
crazy
that
to be even
conversation.
talking that way.
Exactly.
You're not producing widgets, you know? I mean,
Right, and our goal's not only making money,
right.
right? I hope we will always have a society where we have people who want to be firefighters and educators and artists, and the list goes on and on.
Not scramble over each other to try to get to Wall Street like they do today.
Right. And so I think one of the things public higher ed needs to do is re-engage in this conversation with the public and help them understand the relationship between the work that goes on college campuses and the broad societal benefits that accrue from those investments.
Yeah. And that really is the big challenge in the 21st century for higher ed, is to remind America, hey, this is not only important, but this is really what it's all about.
That's right.
Especially from a Jeffersonian perspective, you know, we want people to understand what their rights are and how to protect them. And one way to do that was, in the Jefferson view, was to educate them, and in the context of critical thinking, so that they become citizen leaders who can stand up and say, government can't do that.
That's right.
The powers that be, whatever they are, you can't do that. You know, we need to protect people's rights.
Yes.
So how do you do that? And I know
I don't know. That's
the big question.
the big question.
And,
That's the
and
big
of course,
question.
there's a multitude of ways
Yes.
to do that on a personal level, just talking with a legislator, but also on an international level of crafting a story to tell about the purpose of higher ed specifically and public education
Yes.
in America too.
Yes. Yes.
So what's the thing you're looking forward to most?
Oh,
as
wow.
you head to Texas?
Yeah, a tough question.
Besides Austin.
Yeah, I mean, Austin's a great city.
Oh, it's beautiful.
And the University of Texas at Austin is an amazing institution. There are so many exciting things going on there, and I really can't wait to get started.
Yeah. What are you going to miss most, you think, about, I know it's a tough question, but about UVA, and just take a moment to sort of put a bow on that experience for us.
Yeah, and for me, it's been a very long experience. I attended the University of Virginia as an undergraduate. I lived on the lawn. I was, wahoo-wah all the way through. And what I had always loved about the University of Virginia, the reason I was attracted to come here as a student from another state, was the sense of community that I felt when I visited. There's really something very special about the sense of community at UVA. And I think in many ways it is embodied in the architectural vision that Jefferson set out on the lawn. This idea that faculty and students would form a broader community, I think really is part of UVA's DNA, so to speak. And even though it has grown dramatically from the arrival of the first several dozens of students in 1825, there still continues to be that sense of community, that connection between, not only among students, but between faculty and students, that makes it such a special place. And as a faculty member, and I think this is true for most faculty, the thing about our job we find the most rewarding is working with undergraduates at the University of Virginia. They are extraordinary. They come here with a desire to really change the world and make a difference in life.
Right.
And we see them doing that from the day they walk on grounds.
It's amazing that built environment, the academical village, that even 200 years later still manages to communicate precisely what it had been intended to communicate. That sense of community and of a shared endeavor at this university that has a real historic and arguably unique mission, created to preserve the Enlightenment, the Western Enlightenment.
Yes.
Yeah. Best of luck to you in Austin, Texas.
you.
We will miss you, and thank you for everything you've done here. Charlottesville will miss you.
Thank you.
Maurie McInnis is headed to the University of Texas at Austin, where she will serve as the Executive Vice President and Provost. She's also a professor of art history. I'm Coy Barefoot. You can find me online at coybarefoot.com. I hope you have a terrific week, and y'all be good to each other.